Good morning, everyone. Welcome along. As I say, my name is Pekka. I am the Director of the Training and Education and Development Faculty at ICT. In terms of the international compliance training, as Phil was alluding to, we are the lead training provider for the Professional Association. So we manage the delivery of the training around the world. And as you can see, it's fairly impressive in terms of the sheer geographic spread of where we deliver training around the world. And certainly my colleagues from the Training and Education faculty can vouch to the amount of travel involved. And we do have an external faculty of trainers that we use all over the world. So one of the, I think, unique points of ICT and ICA, it is truly global. And I think that's increasingly important. We don't live in an age where you can focus within your particular narrow jurisdiction. Everything is extraterritorial, so it's really important you get that global perspective. You know, what is emerging best practice in different jurisdictions, in different regulatory regimes, in different organisations, in different sectors? And I think that's a really big benefit of the ICA's global reach. Now, some of you will be familiar with the approach we take to learning, but we have what we call an integrated approach to learning at the ICT. So effectively that means, you know, we acknowledge that people learn in different ways. So we have online course materials, you know, fantastically well-written, in-depth materials, analysing the key cases, key law, key best practices. We also have webinars, so live webinars as well as pre-recorded webinars, sessions where industry experts talk about the key topics. And you know, one of the things about the qualifications is they're aimed at people who are busy. You know, it's trying to cling on to that work-life balance, isn't it? So, you know, you've had a long day at work. The last thing you're going to want to do perhaps is sit down and wade through a course manual. So if you've only got 15 minutes, we recognise that. There are bite-sized learning pieces on the learning platform. So you can go in, you can review a quick webinar, and you can also take a range of self-assessment questions. We also direct you to a range of reading and other resources. So there are many, many links to external and internal white papers, resources that we've got. One of the things that probably worth saying as well, for our students, we do a lot of ongoing support. So there's a very active student community. We've got my colleagues down the back here, David Robson, who's head of our research and development department here. Dave is extremely, I hesitate to use the word guru, but I will. He's a bit of a guru when it comes to social media and networking. And during your training, you'll get the chance to interact with other delegates, other students, as well as the academic faculty. There's an online forum for posting questions. There's a huge presence on social media. So as you're going through your studies, you know, there are a huge range of support mechanisms in place. Okay, yes, the student support area on the website, again, we have a learning platform, which has a vast amount of resources on there to support you as you go through your studies. So, particularly many of you, when you're doing the assessment, it can be a bit daunting coming in to do examinations or formal academic assignments. And look, we appreciate that. So there are study guides, you know, how to go about referencing an assignment, how to prepare for an exam. And there are actually webinars on all of this as well. So linking into the ICA assessment process as well, just to support you in your studies. The final thing I probably want to stress before I talk about some of the specific programs is the workshop experience. Now, this lady has not been paid. I think she looks genuinely happy. And I would suggest that actually that is the overwhelming consensus. When people come to the workshops, they are fun. They really are enjoyable. You know, I think we're really privileged in the training and education faculty that we get the chance to interact generally with people who are interested in the subject, who want to be there, and they want to further their careers. And they are very interactive sessions. Where else are you going to get a chance to sit in a room with 20, 25 other practitioners from different industry sectors, law enforcement, regulators? You know, we get such a diverse range. We get people from oil and gas, we get people from the banks, regulated financial services companies, law enforcement, regulators, and that itself is a learning experience. Now, the workshops are very interactive, based around practical scenarios. And as we go through today, myself and Jonathan are just going to give you a few little tasters of some of the workshop experience, which I think you will hopefully find very, very enjoyable. And it's all about relating the practical aspects of the courses to your day job. Okay. So, I've skipped one over there. So what we're going to do now is just actually focus down into the three broad disciplines in the ICA programs. And I'm going to kick us off by talking about anti-money laundering. Okay, now, it's good to be number one, isn't it? But there are some things I think perhaps we shouldn't be so proud of. And I think the global consensus is now moving towards the position that the City of London is the world's number one centre for money laundering. And I wouldn't disagree with that. Now, if you read the UK's National Risk Assessment for money laundering, it highlights the sheer scale of the problem. So this is not an issue that is academic or theoretical. It's real and it's everywhere. Now, I've worked and looked at serious organised crime groups. I've worked with a lot of law enforcement people. One of the things we emphasise in this program is that we need to shake people out of any complacency that this is an academic subject. It's everywhere. This particular headline referred to a case that was known as the Great British Laundrette. Dozens and dozens of front companies, so-called shell plate companies, used to launder $20 billion through the City of London using fake litigation. And this was corrupt money, some of it drug-related, a lot of it related to embezzled and corrupt funds coming out of Russia. Now, this is an example of the sort of reality of what we'd be looking at. How do money laundering schemes work? Now, we look at the very simple money laundering schemes and we look at the more complex end. Now, this is, for many of you may be familiar with this case, this is one of the scenarios we'll explore in the workshop. This is Lebanese Canadian Bank. Now, this scenario all originated with cartel drugs coming out of South America, Colombia in this case. The drugs were being smuggled via Benin in West Africa. Many of you will be aware West Africa continues to be probably the main staging point for Class A drugs coming into the UK, although some of the flow has been disrupted, but it stood as a massive hub. Now, the drugs were smuggled into Europe where they were sold for cash. Cash was physically smuggled back into Benin where it was intermingled, some of you will know that term, mixed in with the real takings of, I'm not sure this has got a pointer on it, yes it has, with the real takings from used car sales which were shipped into Benin, real used cars. And this is where you see a lot of real tangible businesses being enmeshed into money laundering schemes. Then we saw the involvement of informal currency exchange houses, black market currency exchange houses where you can buy local currency at a much, much superior rate to official government exchange rates. And these informal currency exchange houses are an issue in many developing countries. Now, you might be looking at this and saying, I work for a UK company. How is this relevant to me? Well, this is where it gets interesting. We have here a relationship between a bank, Lebanese Canadian Bank, and these informal currency exchange houses. That's how the illegal money is getting into the mainstream financial system. But it doesn't stop there. Lebanese Canadian Bank, in turn, had a series of correspondent banking relationship with Tier 1 banks, many of them UK banks. So Bill mentioned some of the specialist certificates, correspondent banking risk. You may not even know you have a relationship with a high-risk institution like this. How do you do due diligence to mitigate those risks? And in this case, we saw some of the money being sent back to the US to purchase more used cars. So this is a thing of beauty. This is an ongoing, self-perpetuating scheme. You know, over $200 million went through this scheme. Then we have the rest of the funds being diverted to China to buy tangible, real consumer goods. And again, we'll be looking at the use of international trade, not just trade finance, but trade itself to move illicit capital around the world. And those consumer goods were sent to South America where they were used to buy consumer goods and that sold rather, and that's how the proceeds of the drug trade was sent back to the cartel in Colombia. Also, a terrorist financing angle in here as well. Some of the funds were diverted to Hezbollah. And we will be exploring a lot of focus on terrorist financing. If I was a betting man, and I'm not, I would suggest that terrorist financing is going to become the new focus, certainly for large financial institutions in the next few years. And we'll talk about why that is on the course, not least probably because of the emerging tide of litigation coming out of the US. Okay, so that's just to give you a flavour. In terms of the course itself, risk identification and emerging threats. Very important. Many people I work with, when they work in anti-money laundering, risk roles, they get bogged down in process, policy. We must look outwards. We must know our enemy. And we very much look at what is the latest intelligence of how organised crime, how corrupt politicians actually work. And then we talk about, linked to that, new technology. We train some of the new technology providers. We work very closely with PayPal, for example. PayPal is a bank. But we also look at the emergence of virtual currencies, new payment methods such as mobile money. Very interesting areas which are changing the whole regulatory landscape. The international regulation is changing. The 4th EU Money Laundering Directive. What does it actually mean? Again, in the interest of time, I can't really explore that, but my goodness, there is a lot of change coming there. Bill's already mentioned CDD, beneficial ownership. There's a huge focus on transparency at the moment, understanding who your real customers are, who really controls a legal entity. And we know that corrupt politicians, organised criminals, they deliberately conceal their beneficial ownership. So what practical steps do we take to address that? Sanctions, again, a huge area of focus. You would think it's grey, black and white, wouldn't you? A customer or a payment is on a sanctions list from the Americans or HM Treasury. We can or cannot do that business. But it's horribly grey. For example, your customer does 5% of their business in Iran. Does that mean you can deal with that customer? Well, the answer is it depends. Very, very grey. And we'll be looking at the implications of sanctions a lot on the programme. Trade finance, hugely interesting area. We think the biggest means that corrupt politicians move illicit capital out of developing economies is through trade. We'll explore the trade finance aspect within in terms of documentary trade finance, and we'll also look at dual-use goods, in case you're wondering what that acronym was. And it is death by acronym, I'm afraid, on this course, but we do give you a handy bluffer's guide to acronyms as we go through. But very interesting area, proliferation financing, always in the news. So, Bill's already mentioned this. The courses are a real range in terms of entry level right up to senior level, board level, head of function level. Now, Bill's mentioned already the CDD process being a focus. Now, we have this fantastic new qualification, the Advanced Certificate in Practical Customer Due Diligence. Now, that course uses real artefacts. And by that I mean you will be given a real customer file. You'll be given real adverse media, real corporate documents to understand who a customer is. And we'll walk through that. By the end of the program, you will have a living, breathing, live customer KYC file, taking you through this journey. You've all probably heard of these terms, source of funds and source of wealth. Understanding where your client really generates their wealth from. Understanding what does negative media results mean about your clients. Understanding who really pulls the strings and controls a corporate entity. Okay. Just a few more snapshots of some of the issues here. We know that bribery and corruption, corporate structures are a key focus. Some of you will have seen this report from Transparency International. Amazing figures. 1.3 of all properties in London are registered to overseas companies. Huge amount. And many of these are in what are known as secrecy jurisdictions. I would say it's a bit strong to refer to Jersey and Guernsey as a secrecy jurisdiction, but Transparency International often don't pull their punches. What we do know for sure is there are a vast number of properties in London where nobody can find who actually owns them. And we know that corrupt politicians and organised criminals have chosen the City of London as a haven for their illicit capital. So there's a huge amount of that focus which we'll be exploring on the course and what it means. Some of you will be aware of the new registers of beneficial ownership for companies and, most controversially, for trusts. How are these new registers going to impact industry? How are they going to impact law enforcement? What's going to change? We'll be looking at all of that as we go through. The last thing I want to focus on is a quick snapshot linked to these topics, which is understanding the challenges of identifying who you're actually dealing with. So we look on the course at suspicious activity, reporting suspicious activity, identifying it. Understanding who you're really dealing with is a linked topic. So, for example, here we have a scenario where your client is customer A, company A. We talk about this concept of unwrapping beneficial ownership. Now, I won't go through it in detail other than to say it's a layering process. It's a bit like Russian dolls. Opening the dolls until you hit a living, breathing human being. That's the requirement. The law says you have to understand the true ownership and control structure of a client. So that could be the shadowy person who owns no shares but exercises material control over that entity. Now, how do you write a procedure to do that in a firm? It's very difficult. It requires a flexible approach and it requires critical thinking and analytical skills. And that's what we're teaching on this program. I still work with firms who approach this in a very simplistic, mechanical way. And the danger with doing this unwrapping of corporate structures in a mechanical way is you miss the reality of who controls a corporate structure. Many of you will have heard of the magical figure of 25% plus one share. This is the standard European definition of what a beneficial owner is. Someone who controls 25% plus one share of an entity is considered to be what we call a UBO, an ultimate beneficial owner. So some firms would apply that threshold rigidly, and they would say if someone falls under that threshold, we will do no checks on them at all because they're not a UBO. And the danger with that is you miss the reality of who controls the structure. So here we go. Companies B and C own 50% of your client. That's the ownership structure you're given by a prospective client in a firm. Can you stop there? No? Why not? Because you haven't hit a living, breathing human, have you? The obvious question is, who owns these entities, who in turn owns your customer? So you have to keep unwrapping the structure. And basically, the point of this exercise is as you go through, you will see, here's the ownership structure, that a lot of firms would stop here. They would say, this person, Mr. E, my maths isn't fantastic, but he owns 20% of our customer through this ownership structure because he owns 40% of 50%. Are you with me? Mr. D is, however, a UBO under this 25% threshold. So maybe a firm would get basic AML checks on this gentleman here. But they wouldn't bother doing anything here because this company owns 20% of our customer, therefore there couldn't be a UBO here. So that's it. They haven't done anything on this company because it's publicly listed on a stock market, therefore it's lower risk. So some firms would say we now understand the ownership structure of our customer. Job done. But do we? There's a problem here, isn't there? Someone's hiding. Here he is, Mr. E. Because we failed to unwrap the corporate structure fully, we missed the fact that Mr. E actually owned company X. So now what does that tell us when we look at the structure as a whole? Mr. E is a beneficial owner of our customer. He owns 40% across the structure. Now, and this is a very simplistic example. And quite often, at the bottom of a structure like this, many layers down, You'll get nominees. People who are not the real directors at all have been appointed as proxies. And often these people are all connected. So it's a very challenging area, and we'll be looking at the practical realities of that on the programme. And there's a series of mugshots of the illustrious faculty, some of the training faculty who'll be running the programmes for you. All very experienced practitioners, all fantastic trainers, and who do bring the subject to life. So that's probably all I want to say. I'm conscious we're slightly low on time. Does anyone have any quick questions before I hand over to Chad, who I think is going to give us a presentation on the industry trends? No? Oh, there is one question at the front there, yeah? I think there's a mic coming, sorry, forgive me.
Thank you. In some countries, basically, the question is about how does someone prove where the money comes from?
Yep.
Because like in some countries, trade is going on cash basis.
Yep.
And it's not really like you give a check or receipt or something. And then let's say Mr. A comes to the UK and wants to buy a property, cost £500,000.
Yep. Yep.
The issue is basically for them, so for him actually to prove that this is a legitimate money,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
but he can't prove it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how do you go?
It's a very common problem. So the source of wealth, understanding and proving that you've taken reasonable steps to the source of wealth, the regulatory requirements are actually very nebulous. So it's really left to you on a risk-based approach to do reasonable inquiries and demonstrate that you've got independent verification of what the customer is telling you, and the information you've got is plausible and reasonable based on the information you hold on that customer. So that might, for example, involve getting confirmation from an independent trusted legal advisor or accountant. It might involve doing third-party due diligence reports. It might involve doing media reports. But whatever you do, you must be able to demonstrate you've taken reasonable steps. And if you listen quietly now, you can hear the sound of remediation on that sort of file going on in virtually all the tier 1 banks at the moment, because the banks in the last 3 or 4 years have been told that the depth they've been going to on files like that has not been good enough. And we will be looking at specific examples of what good practice is in that area and what good practice isn't. And if you want to have a chat with me during a break, happy to. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, Joe, there's one question behind you.
Good morning. I just wanted to ask, the course itself, is it a face-to-face course or is it taught online? And that's the level 6?
Yes, so the diploma.
Yeah.
Yes. What was the issue? Is it face-to-face or online? So I can feel that, sure. So the answer is the diploma can be done face-to-face. There are, as Bill's alluded to, there are workshops, full workshops during a course of 9 to 12 months. You can also study the program distance learning. So by distance learning, we don't, it's not just online, but you get a course manual, you get a workbook, distance learning workbook, and you get live webinars as well supporting you. So the answer is there's options either way. I mean, I would recommend if you're based in the UK that the workshop option is probably preferable in terms of the experience, but the distance learning is a very good option as well if that's not practical for you. Okay.